They laughed when they saw her name on the invitation. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Some whispered behind crystal glasses filled with champagne that cost more than her monthly salary. Others smiled, not with kindness, not with warmth, but with mockery. With the kind of cruelty that only comes from people who have never known struggle. Because in a room filled with millionaires, politicians, CEOs, and powerful families whose names appeared in Forbes and Fortune magazines, one name did not belong. A maid. A woman who cleaned floors with cracked, calloused hands. A woman who scrubbed toilets in bathrooms larger than most people's bedrooms. A woman who ate leftovers after everyone else had gone to bed, alone in a small room with peeling wallpaper and a window that wouldn't close all the way. She was invited not to be honored, not to be celebrated, not even to be acknowledged as a human being with feelings and dignity. She was invited to be humiliated. To be laughed at. To be reminded of her place in a world that had already decided she didn't matter. What no one knew, what no one in that glittering ballroom could possibly imagine, was that by the end of that night, the laughter would die. The music would stop. The champagne glasses would be set down with trembling hands. And the truth, the devastating, earth-shattering truth, would silence everyone. This is not just a story about wealth and poverty. It is not just a story about the gap between the haves and the have-nots. This is a story about pride and what it costs. About destiny and whether it can be delayed but never denied. About the danger, the profound danger, of underestimating the quiet ones. The ones who watch. The ones who wait. The ones who remember everything. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about justice, patience, and the price of arrogance. Before we go any deeper into this remarkable true story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, whether you're in New York or California, Texas or Florida, or anywhere else in the world. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We share stories that matter, stories that move you, stories that make you think long after the screen goes dark. Now, let's continue with a story that will stay with you forever. Who was this woman, really? What secrets lived behind those tired eyes that had seen too much? Why did the rich man invite her, and why was he so confident she would fail, that she would crumble under the weight of his cruelty? What secret followed her into that grand hall, hidden beneath her calm exterior? And how did a joke, a simple, thoughtless joke meant to disgrace her and provide entertainment for the wealthy, turn into the moment that changed every single life in that room forever? This night would expose more than wealth. It would expose more than the gap between rich and poor. It would expose hearts. It would reveal who people really were when the masks came off. It would show what happens when the powerful forget that every person has a story, and some stories have endings that no one sees coming. The questions multiplied like ripples in water. How long had she known? How long had she carried this secret, this burden, this truth that could destroy everything? Why did she wait 15 years, cleaning floors and biting her tongue while insults rained down like winter snow? What strength does it take to serve someone who stole everything from you? What kind of patience allows you to smile at the person who ruined your life? And most importantly, when the moment finally came, when the truth finally emerged from the shadows where it had been hiding for over a decade, would she choose revenge or redemption? Would she become what they feared, or would she show them something they had never seen before? These questions hung in the air that night, invisible to everyone except the one woman who held all the answers. And she was in no hurry to reveal them. His name was Edward Harrington. If you lived in the state, you knew that name. It was printed on buildings. It was mentioned in business journals. It appeared on charity gala programs and political campaign donor lists. Edward Harrington, self-made tycoon, billionaire, philanthropist, visionary. That was the story everyone knew. That was the legend he had spent 40 years building, brick by brick, deal by deal, photograph by photograph. Steel factories that employed thousands. Real estate empires that stretched across 3 states. Private jets. Vacation homes in Aspen and the Hamptons. A yacht that had been featured in Architectural Digest. From the outside, he had everything. From the outside, Edward Harrington was the American dream personified. The boy from modest beginnings who had clawed his way to the top through hard work, intelligence, and an iron will that refused to accept failure. But inside, where no cameras could reach, where no journalists were allowed, Edward carried something darker. Something that had been growing for decades, feeding on success like a parasite. A hunger to feel superior. A need, almost an addiction, to remind others that they were beneath him. He believed, truly believed, that poverty was a choice. That the poor were poor because they were lazy, because they lacked ambition, because they didn't want it badly enough. And the rich, people like him, were rich because they deserved it. Because they were smarter. Because they worked harder. Because they were simply better. To Edward, people were not equal. They were ranked. There was a hierarchy, and he stood at the top, looking down at everyone else with a mixture of pity and contempt. And he never, ever missed a chance to remind others where they stood on that ladder. At business meetings, when waiters would bring coffee or water, Edward would look at them and say things like, "You see, gentlemen. That's what happens when you don't apply yourself in school. That's what happens when you settle for good enough instead of pushing for excellence." The other executives would laugh nervously, unsure if he was joking or serious. He was always serious. At charity galas, events where the wealthy gathered to write checks and feel good about themselves, Edward donated large sums. 6 figures at a time. But he didn't donate out of compassion. He didn't give because he cared about the causes or the people suffering. He donated to hear his name announced over microphones. To see it printed in programs. To watch other wealthy people applaud and acknowledge that he had given more than them. Every act of generosity was a performance, a calculated move in the endless game of status and recognition. His children rarely saw him. He had 2 sons and a daughter. They lived in the same massive mansion, but they might as well have lived in different cities. Edward was always working, always traveling, always at some meeting or event or deal that was more important than birthdays or graduations or quiet moments together. His sons grew up trying desperately to earn his approval, competing against each other for scraps of attention. His daughter stopped trying by the time she was 12, building walls around her heart that even therapy couldn't fully break down years later. His wife, Margaret, lived in a separate wing of the mansion. They had stopped sharing a bedroom 15 years ago. They appeared together at public events, smiling for cameras, playing the role of the perfect power couple. But in private, they barely spoke. Margaret had her charity work, her book clubs, her circle of wealthy friends who also lived in beautiful cages. Edward had his empire. And somewhere along the way, they had both accepted that this was what success looked like. Lonely. Cold. Hollow. Edward's world was built on control. Everything had to be managed, organized, dominated. He controlled his companies with an iron fist, firing executives who questioned his decisions. He controlled his public image through a team of publicists and lawyers who made problems disappear. He controlled his family through money, using wealth as both carrot and stick, promising inheritances while threatening to cut people off if they disappointed him. And he controlled the narrative of his own life, telling and retelling the story of his rise to power, editing out the parts that didn't fit, emphasizing the struggles he wanted people to believe he had overcome. But there were parts of his story that even Edward had started to forget. Convenient gaps in memory. Details that had been buried so long they felt like they belonged to someone else. And at the center of those gaps was a name he never spoke. A face he had trained himself not to see when it appeared in old photographs. A brother who had trusted him. A brother he had betrayed. Her name was Grace. Just Grace. No middle name, no maiden name that she used anymore. Grace was all that remained after life had stripped everything else away. She worked in Edward's mansion for over 15 years. 15 years of arriving before sunrise, when the sky was still dark and the streets were empty except for delivery trucks and insomniacs. 15 years of leaving long after midnight, when the family was asleep and the house was finally quiet except for the settling sounds old buildings make. She cleaned rooms she would never sleep in, rooms with beds that cost more than cars, with sheets that had thread counts she couldn't even imagine, with pillows imported from Europe and mattresses that adjusted to your body temperature. She dusted furniture that belonged in museums. She vacuumed carpets so thick and soft you could sleep on them. She organized closets the size of apartments, filled with clothes that still had price tags, things bought and forgotten, worn once or never. She cooked meals she would never taste. Edward employed a head chef, of course, a man trained in Paris who prepared elaborate dinners for guests. But Grace cooked too, the simple meals, the breakfasts, the late-night snacks when Edward came home from business trips and wanted something familiar. She made his coffee exactly how he liked it, strong and black with just a touch of cream, served at precisely 170 degrees. She knew which newspapers he wanted on his desk and in what order. She knew which brands of soap he preferred, which way he liked his shirts folded, which temperature he wanted the house kept at during different seasons. She knew everything about his life, his preferences, his habits, his routines. And he knew almost nothing about her. To Edward, Grace was part of the furniture. Functional. Necessary. Invisible. Her hands were rough, scarred from years of cleaning products and hot water. Her back often ached, especially in the mornings, from bending and lifting and reaching. Her knees protested when she climbed the mansion's 3 flights of stairs, carrying laundry, or supplies or trays of food. Her shoes had been resoled more times than she could count, the leather cracked and worn, but still functional, and Grace believed in using things until they absolutely couldn't be used anymore. She wore the same simple dresses, rotating through 5 of them, washing them by hand each week. She kept her hair pulled back in a tight bun, practical and out of the way. She wore no makeup, no jewelry except for one item she kept hidden under her collar. No one ever asked about her life. No one asked if she had family, if she had dreams, if she ever got tired or sad or angry. She was just the maid. The help. The invisible woman who made their lives comfortable. But Grace had once had a different life. She had been someone before she became invisible. She had once been a wife, young and hopeful, married to a man named Thomas who worked in a factory and dreamed of saving enough money to open his own small business someday. They lived in a modest apartment, nothing fancy, but it was theirs, and they filled it with love and laughter and plans for the future. They talked late into the night about the children they would have, the house they would buy, the life they would build together. Thomas worked long hours, double shifts when he could get them, saving every penny. And then one day, he went to work and didn't come home. Factory accident. Faulty equipment that should have been replaced years ago but wasn't because it was expensive and the company was cutting costs to maximize profits. Thomas died instantly, they told her. He didn't suffer. As if that made it better. As if knowing he died quickly somehow filled the void he left behind. Grace was pregnant when Thomas died. She didn't know yet. She found out 2 weeks after the funeral, sitting in a doctor's office, staring at test results, feeling joy and grief crash into each other like waves. She had a part of Thomas still. A piece of him that would live on. She named the baby James, after Thomas's father. She raised that boy with everything she had, pouring all the love she would have given Thomas into this small, perfect human who had his father's eyes and smile. She worked 3 jobs. Cleaning houses during the day. Waitressing at night. Taking in laundry on weekends. She slept 4 hours a night if she was lucky. She bought clothes from thrift stores and made them last years. She cooked cheap meals, rice and beans, pasta and vegetables, making every dollar stretch as far as possible. But she made sure James had what he needed. School supplies. Books. A warm coat in winter. Birthday cakes, even if they were simple ones she made herself. James was brilliant. Teachers told her so at every parent conference. He could be anything he wanted, they said. Doctor, lawyer, engineer. He had that kind of mind, the kind that absorbed information like a sponge and made connections others missed. Grace saved every penny for his education. She had a coffee can under her bed where she put tips and spare change, money she was collecting for college, for James's future. He was going to be the first person in their family to go to university. He was going to have opportunities she and Thomas never had. He was going to escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped so many. That was the dream. That was what kept Grace going through exhaustion and pain and the grinding weight of just trying to survive. But life, cruel and arbitrary, had other plans. James got sick when he was 19. Started feeling tired all the time. Losing weight. Bruising easily. Grace knew something was wrong before the doctors confirmed it. Leukemia. Aggressive. Advanced. The kind that required immediate treatment, chemotherapy, possible bone marrow transplant, hospital stays that could stretch for months. The treatments were expensive. Grace's insurance from her cleaning jobs was minimal, covering almost nothing. She sold everything she owned that had any value. Furniture, jewelry, the few nice things she had kept from her marriage. She borrowed from everyone she knew, exhausting every connection, every favor, every possibility. She took out loans with interest rates that should have been illegal. She worked more hours, taking every shift offered, sleeping in hospital waiting rooms between jobs. James fought. God, how he fought. He endured treatments that made him sick, that stole his hair and his strength, that left him weak and hollow-eyed but still smiling when she visited, still pretending to be strong for her even though they both knew he was dying. The treatments bought time, months of hope and fear tangled together. But in the end, it wasn't enough. James passed away on a rainy November morning, the kind of dark, cold day that feels like the world is mourning too. He was 20 years old. Grace was 43. And for the second time in her life, she buried someone she loved more than her own existence. The debt remained. The bills kept coming. Grace had nothing left to sell, no one left to borrow from. She was drowning, working herself to exhaustion just to pay interest on loans she would never be able to fully repay. That's when she found a job at the Harrington Mansion. It paid more than her other jobs combined. It came with a small room on the property, saving her rent. It was a lifeline, even if it meant serving people who treated her like furniture. She took it. She moved into the small room with the peeling wallpaper and the window that wouldn't close all the way. She learned Edward's preferences, his schedules, his moods. She became invisible. And she survived. Day by day, month by month, year by year. But survival wasn't living. It was just existing. Just breathing and moving and working until you were too tired to feel anymore. Grace spoke softly, her voice quiet and gentle, the kind of voice that never demanded attention or insisted on being heard. She smiled gently, a small, sad smile that never quite reached her eyes. And when insulted, when Edward or his friends made jokes about the help or commented on how lucky she was to work for such a generous employer or suggested that poor people should just work harder like he did, she answered with silence. She had learned that arguing with people like Edward was pointless. They didn't want to understand. They didn't want their worldview challenged. They wanted to believe that they deserved everything they had, and that meant believing that people like Grace deserved everything they didn't have. So she stayed quiet. She nodded when expected to nod. She said, "Yes, sir," and, "Of course, sir," and, "Right away, sir." She played the role they had assigned her. But inside, where no one could see, where no one thought to look, Grace was someone entirely different. She was someone who remembered everything. Someone who watched and listened and noticed details others missed. Someone who had been gathering pieces of a puzzle for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to show everyone what the picture really looked like. The other staff respected Grace. The younger maids came to her with problems, knowing she would listen without judgment. The gardener shared his lunch with her sometimes, sitting in comfortable silence under the oak tree behind the garage. The driver, an older man named Frank who had worked for the family even longer than Grace, would sometimes shake his head and say, "You're too good for this place, Grace. Too good for these people." And she would smile that sad smile and say, "We all do what we have to do, Frank. We all survive the best way we know how." What no one noticed, what no one suspected because they had all decided Grace was too simple, too beaten down by life to be anything other than what she appeared to be, was that Grace was observing everything. She heard conversations through cracked doors when she cleaned the hallways. She saw documents left carelessly on desks when she dusted offices. She knew which deals Edward closed in secret, which friendships were fake, which business partners he was planning to betray, which politicians he bought, which journalists he paid to write favorable stories. She knew where bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. And she knew something else, something that no one in that house suspected. She knew the truth about Edward Harrington. She knew where his fortune really came from. She knew the lie at the foundation of his empire. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that one day, somehow, the truth would matter. In those quiet moments, late at night when the mansion was asleep and the only sounds were the settling of old wood and the distant hum of traffic on the highway, Grace would sit in her small room and stare at an old photograph. A photograph she kept hidden in a wooden box under her bed, wrapped in cloth to protect it from dust and time. The photograph showed two men, both young, both smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. Brothers. One of them looked remarkably like Edward. The same strong jaw, the same confident eyes, the same hint of arrogance in the tilt of his head. The other man was softer somehow, kinder in the eyes, with a smile that looked genuine rather than calculated. That man was her father. Jonathan Harrington. And the other man, the one who looked like Edward, was Edward's father, Jonathan's younger brother, Robert. Grace would stare at that photograph and remember the stories her mother had told her before dementia took those memories away. Stories about Jonathan, about the company he built from nothing, about the brother he trusted, about the betrayal that came when trust was at its highest. And Grace would whisper to the empty room, to the ghost of her father, "I haven't forgotten. I will never forget. And soon, very soon, everyone will know what I know." Edward was planning his 60th birthday gala, an event so extravagant it would be talked about for years, maybe decades. This wasn't just a party. This was a coronation, a monument to himself, a declaration that he had reached the pinnacle of success and power. He rented the entire ballroom of the Grand Regency Hotel, the most exclusive venue in the city, the kind of place where you needed connections just to get a reservation for dinner, let alone book the ballroom. He hired the best event planner in the state, a woman who had coordinated weddings for celebrities and charity events for presidents. No expense was spared. None. Ice sculptures that took artists 3 days to create. Live orchestras flown in from Vienna. A champagne fountain that cost more than most people earned in a year, flowing with vintage champagne that sold for thousands of dollars per bottle. Flower arrangements that looked like they belonged in royal gardens. A 7-tier cake that required structural engineering to ensure it wouldn't collapse. Lighting design that transformed the ballroom into something from a fairy tale, all gold and crystal and soft, flattering light that made everyone look like they belonged in a movie. The guest list was carefully curated. Celebrities confirmed their attendance, actors and musicians whose faces appeared on magazine covers. Politicians sent gifts in advance, expensive bottles of wine and rare cigars, along with handwritten notes about how much they looked forward to celebrating with him. Old money families, the kind whose wealth stretched back generations, whose ancestors had signed important documents and owned vast estates, marked their calendars and arranged their schedules around Edward's birthday. CEOs and business tycoons confirmed attendance, competitors and allies alike, all wanting to be seen at the event, all wanting to maintain relationships with Edward Harrington. This was not just a party. It was the social event of the season. An invitation to Edward's 60th birthday gala meant you mattered. It meant you were part of the inner circle of power and influence. It meant you belonged. And not being invited meant the opposite. It meant you had been forgotten or dismissed or deemed unworthy. The invitation itself was a status symbol, printed on heavy cardstock with gold embossing, sealed in hand-addressed envelopes with wax seals bearing the Harrington family crest. Then, one evening about 3 weeks before the gala, after the final guest list had been approved and the invitations had been sent, Edward sat with his closest friends in his study. These were men he had known for decades, business partners and golf buddies, men who shared his view of the world and his belief that success justified everything. They were drinking scotch, expensive single malt that had been aged longer than some of their children had been alive, talking about the upcoming party, laughing about who would be there and who would be desperate to be there but hadn't been invited. The conversation drifted, as it often did among men with too much money and too much time, to complaints about employees, about how hard it was to find good help these days, about how entitled people had become, expecting benefits and fair wages and respect just for showing up and doing the bare minimum. Someone mentioned a recent news story about a lawsuit against a wealthy family by their former housekeeper, claiming unpaid wages and mistreatment. The men in the study shook their heads, agreeing that people were too quick to sue these days, too ready to blame others for their own failures. Edward, feeling the warm buzz of whiskey and the comfortable superiority that came from being surrounded by people who agreed with everything he said, leaned back in his leather chair and said, "You know what would be funny? What would be absolutely hilarious?" The other men looked at him, curious, smiling already in anticipation of whatever Edward was about to say. He continued, "Let's invite the maid. Let's invite Grace to the gala." There was a moment of confused silence. Then understanding dawned, and the room burst into laughter. Someone slapped the arm of his chair, wheezing with amusement. Another man, tears forming in his eyes from laughing, said, "Edward, that's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. Make sure she wears her cleaning uniform." Another added, "She won't even know which fork to use. She'll probably use her hands." More laughter. Edward grinned, pleased with himself, enjoying the reaction. "Exactly," he said. "Exactly. It'll be a reminder to everyone there. A reminder of where they came from, and more importantly, where they could end up if they're not careful. If they get lazy. If they stop pushing. If they settle." The idea delighted them. One man suggested they seat Grace at the main table, right up front where everyone could see her. Another thought they should announce her arrival, really draw attention to it. Edward loved all of it. This wasn't cruelty to him. This was a teaching moment. This was showing people the full spectrum of society, from the heights of success to the depths of service. He genuinely believed he was providing a valuable lesson, that seeing Grace uncomfortable and out of place would motivate people to work harder, to appreciate what they had, to understand that they were the winners in life's great competition. It never occurred to him that this was vicious. It never occurred to him that Grace had feelings, that she might be humiliated, that this would hurt her. She was the help. The help didn't have feelings that mattered. The help existed to serve. And if they could also serve as cautionary tales, as examples of what failure looked like, then that was just part of their function. The decision was made. Grace would be invited. They toasted to it, raising their glasses, laughing about what a memorable night it would be. The invitation was prepared the next morning. Edward's assistant, a young woman who felt uncomfortable about the whole thing but knew better than to question her boss, created the invitation using the same template as all the others. Heavy cardstock. Gold embossing. Hand-addressed envelope. Wax seal with the Harrington crest. Everything identical to the invitations that had been sent to senators and celebrities. The assistant hesitated before printing it, her finger hovering over the button, wondering if she should say something, if she should point out how cruel this was. But she needed this job. She had student loans and rent and a mother in a nursing home whose care wasn't cheap. So she printed the invitation. She sealed it in the envelope. And she set it aside to be delivered to Grace. That afternoon, Grace was scrubbing the kitchen floor, on her hands and knees with a brush, working on a stubborn stain near the refrigerator. One of the housekeepers, a younger woman named Maria who had started working at the mansion only 6 months ago, approached her nervously. "Grace," Maria said quietly. "This came for you." She held out the envelope. Grace sat back on her heels, wiping her wet hands on her apron. She looked at the envelope, at the gold embossing and wax seal, and her face showed nothing. No surprise. No confusion. Nothing. She took the envelope, thanked Maria, and set it aside on the counter. Maria lingered, concerned. It's an invitation to Mr. Harrington's birthday gala," she said. "I saw them being prepared." "Grace, it's a joke. They want to embarrass you. Please don't go. Don't give them the satisfaction." Grace looked up at Maria, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Something that made Maria take an involuntary step back. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something Maria couldn't quite identify. Then it was gone, and Grace's face was calm again, that same gentle, tired expression she always wore. "Thank you for warning me, Maria," Grace said softly. "That was kind of you. But don't worry about me. I'll be fine." Maria wanted to say more, wanted to insist that Grace not go, but something in Grace's tone told her the conversation was over. She nodded and walked away, looking back once to see Grace still kneeling on the floor, the invitation sitting on the counter above her, sealed and waiting. That night, alone in her small room with the peeling wallpaper and the window that wouldn't close all the way, Grace held the invitation in her hands. She broke the wax seal carefully, preserving it. She pulled out the card and read it slowly, her eyes moving over every word. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the 60th birthday of Edward Harrington." She read the date, the time, the location. She read the dress code, black tie. She read the RSVP instructions. Then she set the invitation down on her small table and sat very still for a long time, staring at nothing, thinking. Finally, she whispered to the empty room, "So, the time has come." She stood and pulled the wooden box from under her bed. She had kept this box for 15 years, waiting. Inside were documents, carefully organized in folders. Legal papers. Financial records. Contracts and agreements signed decades ago. Bank statements showing transfers of money and ownership. There were photographs, not just the one of her father and his brother, but others showing buildings being constructed, showing men in business suits shaking hands, showing newspaper clippings from 30 years ago with headlines about a rising young entrepreneur named Jonathan Harrington. There was also a ring, wrapped in soft cloth. Grace unwrapped it carefully and held it up to the light. Gold, heavy and old-fashioned, with an engraved crest on the face. The Harrington family crest, the same one that appeared on the wax seal of the invitation, the same one that appeared on the gates of the mansion where she worked. This ring had belonged to her father. Her mother had given it to her before dementia took her memories, pressing it into Grace's hand with urgent intensity. "Don't let them forget him," her mother had said, eyes clear for just a moment. "Don't let them erase what he built. Promise me, Grace. Promise me you'll tell the truth someday." And Grace had promised. She had carried that promise for 15 years, through grief and exhaustion and the daily indignity of serving the family that had stolen everything from her. Her hands trembled now as she held the ring. Not from fear. Not from anxiety. But from memory. From the weight of 15 years of patience finally coming to an end. From the knowledge that her moment, the moment she had been preparing for, building toward, gathering evidence for, was finally here. Edward had opened the door himself. He had invited her into his world, thinking she would be humiliated. He had no idea what he had done. He had no idea who she really was. And he had no idea that by the time this night was over, everything he believed about himself, everything he had built his identity on, would be shattered beyond repair. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Because what happens next, the preparation and the night of the gala itself, will test everything you think you know about justice, patience, and what it means to stand up for truth even when the entire world has dismissed you as insignificant. Grace faced a choice in the days following the invitation. She could stay home, protect what remained of her pride, avoid the humiliation that Edward and his friends had planned for her. Or she could go, walk directly into their trap, and face whatever mockery and cruelty they had prepared. For anyone else, the choice would have been obvious. Stay home. Preserve your dignity. Don't give them the satisfaction. But Grace was not like anyone else. She had not survived everything she had survived, had not endured 15 years of serving the man who destroyed her family, had not gathered evidence and waited patiently for the right moment, only to back down now when the door finally opened. She was going. She had always been going. From the moment she received that invitation, there was never any doubt. This was the moment she had been preparing for. This was the moment when patience would be rewarded and truth would finally have its day. But going meant preparing. Not just emotionally, though that was part of it. Grace spent hours in prayer, asking for strength, asking for clarity, asking that when the moment came she would have the courage to speak and the wisdom to say what needed to be said in a way that would be heard. She prepared practically as well. She contacted the lawyer she had been working with quietly for the past 3 years, a man named David Chen who had taken her case pro bono after hearing her story, moved by the injustice of it and convinced that the evidence was solid. David had been helping her organize documents, track down witnesses, prepare the legal framework for what would need to happen once the truth came out. He had initially advised waiting longer, building an even stronger case, but when Grace told him about the gala invitation, he immediately understood. "This is it," he said over the phone, excitement and nervousness mixing in his voice. "This is the opportunity we've been waiting for. If you reveal everything at a public event like this, in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, they won't be able to bury it. They won't be able to make it disappear quietly. Are you ready for this, Grace? Are you absolutely certain?" Grace was certain. More certain than she had been of anything since James's diagnosis, since the moment the doctor had told her there was nothing more they could do. David sent over copies of the most important documents, the ones Grace would need to bring with her. He also arranged for several witnesses to be present, people who had worked with her father decades ago, people who had seen the betrayal happen, people who had remained silent out of fear or self-preservation but who were now, finally, willing to speak. One of them was Charles Whitmore, an elderly man who had been Jonathan Harrington's business partner in the early days of the steel company. Charles had watched Robert Harrington, Edward's father, slowly manipulate Jonathan, convince him to sign over temporary control of the company, promise to take care of Jonathan's family if anything ever happened. And then Jonathan had disappeared. A car accident, the police said. Tragic but straightforward. Except Charles had always suspected it wasn't an accident. He had seen Robert's face when they identified the body. There had been no grief. Only cold calculation. Charles had been too afraid to speak up then, afraid of what Robert might do, afraid of losing everything. But 30 years of guilt had worn him down. When David contacted him and explained what Grace was trying to do, Charles had wept. "I should have said something," he told David. "I should have protected her father. I was a coward. Let me make it right now. Let me tell the truth." Grace also prepared emotionally by visiting the cemetery where Thomas and James were buried, side by side under a simple headstone that had taken her years to pay off. She knelt between the graves, touching both headstones with her worn hands. "I wish you were here," she whispered. "I wish you could see what's about to happen. Thomas, you always believed truth mattered. You always said that the arc of justice was long but it bent toward righteousness. I'm about to test that belief. And James, my sweet boy, I'm doing this partly for you. For the future you never got to have. For all the children who deserve better than a world where the powerful can steal and lie and face no consequences. She stayed there for over an hour, talking to them, crying quietly, drawing strength from their memory. When she finally stood to leave, she felt different. Lighter somehow. Ready. The question of what to wear was more complicated than it might seem. Grace's entire wardrobe consisted of practical work clothes and a few simple dresses she wore on her rare days off. She owned nothing appropriate for a black tie gala. She certainly couldn't afford to buy anything new. But this problem solved itself in an unexpected way. Maria, the young housekeeper who had warned Grace about the invitation, showed up at Grace's door one evening carrying a garment bag. "My mother heard about what's happening," Maria said, speaking quickly as if afraid Grace would turn her away. "She used to work in fashion, alterations and design. She made this for you. Please, Grace, let us help you." Grace tried to protest, but Maria was insistent. "You've been kind to me since I started here. You've helped me when I made mistakes, covered for me when I was running late, shared your lunch with me when I forgot mine. Please let us, do this for you." Grace relented, and when she opened the garment bag, tears filled her eyes. The dress was beautiful. Deep navy blue, simple in cut but elegant in every line. It wasn't flashy or covered in sequins or trying too hard. It was dignified, timeless, the kind of dress that spoke of quiet confidence. Maria's mother had somehow gotten Grace's measurements, probably from Maria, and the fit was perfect. "Tell your mother thank you," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell her this means more than she could possibly know." Grace also prepared mentally by rehearsing what she would say. She stood in her small room night after night, speaking to her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser, practicing her words, her tone, her delivery. She needed to be clear but not angry. Firm but not vengeful. She needed to present facts, not emotions, even though emotions threatened to overwhelm her every time she thought about what had been stolen from her family. She practiced staying calm when she imagined Edward's face, imagined his shock and denial, imagined the ways he might try to deflect or attack or dismiss her. She prepared for every possibility she could think of, knowing that despite all her preparation, the night would likely unfold in ways she couldn't predict. But that was all right. She had truth on her side. She had evidence. She had witnesses. And most importantly, she had survived 15 years of waiting for this moment. She could survive whatever came next. The day before the gala, Grace received an unexpected visitor. Frank, the driver who had worked for the Harrington family even longer than Grace, knocked on her door in the evening. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if worried someone might see him. "Can I come in?" he asked. Grace nodded, stepping aside to let him enter her small room. Frank looked around, taking in the modest space, the threadbare rug, the furniture that had been donated or discarded by others. His jaw tightened. "I've worked for this family for 23 years, he said without preamble. "I've kept my mouth shut about a lot of things. Things I saw. Things I heard. Conversations I drove them to and from. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I needed the job. But Grace, what they're doing to you, inviting you to that gala to humiliate you, it's wrong. It's cruel. And I can't stay quiet anymore." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found this years ago, tucked in the back of an old filing cabinet that was being thrown out. I kept it because something about it felt important, even though I didn't know why. But now, after overhearing some things, after putting pieces together, I think this might help you." He handed her the paper. Grace unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a letter, old and yellowed, written in careful handwriting. It was from Robert Harrington to a lawyer, dated 30 years ago, just a month after Jonathan's death. The letter discussed finalizing the transfer of assets and ensuring no complications from the brothers' estate. It mentioned Jonathan by name, discussed his lack of a will, which was a lie because Grace had a copy of her father's will in her box, and outlined steps to secure complete control of the company. It was evidence. Clear, damning evidence of intent. Grace looked up at Frank, tears streaming down her face. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked. "You could lose your job. Edward will retaliate." Frank's face was set, determined. "I'm old, Grace. I'll find another job, or I'll retire. But I can't take this to my grave. I can't die knowing I had evidence of what that family did and I kept it hidden because I was afraid. You take that letter tomorrow night. You show everyone what I should have shown someone 30 years ago. And whatever happens, happens." The night before the gala, Grace barely slept. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle and creak around her. She thought about her father, tried to remember his face clearly, though the memories had faded over 30 years. She thought about her mother, who had died 5 years ago in a nursing home, her mind gone, unable to remember Grace's name by the end but still occasionally murmuring about Jonathan, about betrayal, about justice that never came. She thought about Thomas and James, about the life they should have had, about the grandson her father never got to meet, about all the ways that Robert Harrington's greed had rippled through time, destroying not just one generation but multiple. And she thought about tomorrow, about walking into that ballroom, about the moment when she would finally speak the truth that had been silenced for 3 decades. She felt afraid, which was natural. She felt angry, which was justified. But more than anything, she felt determined. Ready. This was her moment, and she would not waste it. The night of the gala arrived like something out of a movie, all dramatic clouds and golden sunset bleeding into purple twilight. The Grand Regency Hotel stood like a palace, every window lit, spotlights sweeping the sky, red carpet rolling down the entrance steps like a tongue of blood. Luxury cars began arriving at 7 o'clock, a parade of wealth so excessive it almost seemed like parody. Bentleys and Rolls-Royces and Mercedes that cost more than houses lined up, waiting their turn to deposit their precious cargo at the entrance. Valets in white gloves opened doors with practiced efficiency, their faces carefully neutral as women in gowns that cost tens of thousands of dollars stepped out, one hand holding their dresses, the other adjusting diamond necklaces or smoothing already perfect hair. Men in tuxedos followed, checking their cufflinks, straightening their bow ties, scanning the crowd to see who had arrived and who was watching them arrive. Inside, the ballroom glowed like something from a fairy tale, though perhaps a dark one. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, each one containing hundreds of lights that had been individually adjusted to create the perfect ambience. Tables were draped in silk, deep burgundy and gold, each centerpiece a work of art featuring flowers that had been flown in from 3 different countries and arranged by a florist who charged by the stem. The ice sculptures had been placed strategically throughout the room, catching and reflecting light, turning slowly to prevent uneven melting. The champagne fountain was already flowing, vintage champagne that tasted like sunshine and clouds and money, served in crystal flutes by waiters who moved through the crowd like ghosts, always present but never intrusive. A string quartet played classical music in one corner, filling the spaces between conversations with melody that most guests didn't consciously hear but would have missed if it stopped. Everything was perfect. Everything was calculated. Everything was designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind everyone present that they were among the elite, the chosen, the successful. Edward stood near the center of it all, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, soaking in the attention like a plant absorbs sunlight. He wore a custom tuxedo that had required 3 fittings, made from fabric so fine it felt like water. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. His watch was Swiss, complicated, worth more than most people's cars. Every few minutes, someone would pull him aside to congratulate him, to thank him for the invitation, to tell him what an incredible evening this was. And he would smile that smile, the one that said, I know I'm amazing, thank you for noticing. His wife Margaret stood nearby, beautiful and cold in a silver gown, playing her role with the practice of decades. She smiled at the right times, laughed at the right jokes, touched people's arms with just the right amount of warmth to seem genuine without actually committing to any real connection. Their children were scattered throughout the room. The eldest son, Edward Jr., was networking aggressively, already thinking about when he would take over the company. The younger son, Michael, stood at the bar nursing his third drink, looking uncomfortable in his tuxedo. The daughter, Catherine, had arrived late and was avoiding her parents, talking to friends near one of the ice sculptures, her laughter a bit too loud, her smile a bit too bright. The guests were a cross-section of power and wealth. There were actors whose faces everyone recognized, who couldn't walk 10 feet without being stopped for photos or autographs, even here among people who were supposed to be too sophisticated to care about celebrities. There were politicians, senators and congressmen, a few judges, even a governor who had flown in specifically for this event because Edward was a major campaign donor and you didn't turn down Edward Harrington's invitations if you wanted his support in the next election. There were old money families, the Vanderbilts and Rockefellers of their region, people whose wealth was so old and established that they didn't need to prove anything to anyone, who moved through the world with the ease of people who had never once worried about money or status or security. There were business tycoons, rivals and allies alike, CEOs of companies everyone had heard of, men and women who controlled billions of dollars and thousands of jobs, who made decisions that affected entire industries and economies. And they were all here, all gathered in this room, all celebrating Edward Harrington. The conversations were what you would expect. Business deals discussed in corners. Political alliances formed over champagne. Gossip traded like currency. Who was sleeping with whom? Who was about to be fired or promoted or indicted? Which companies were planning mergers? Which politicians were about to announce campaigns? The room hummed with information, with power, with the casual cruelty of people who had so much that they couldn't imagine having nothing. Someone made a joke about their maid accidentally shrinking a favorite sweater, and the group around them laughed. Someone else complained about having to let their driver go because he had asked for a raise, and people nodded sympathetically. These were the kinds of problems people in this room had. Irritating but ultimately insignificant. Nothing that actually threatened their comfort or security or fundamental understanding of the world. They existed in a bubble, and they had no idea how fragile that bubble was. They had no idea that it was about to pop. At exactly 8:15, right on schedule according to the invitation, a car arrived at the entrance. It was not a limousine. It was not a luxury sedan. It was a modest vehicle, a 10-year-old Honda that had been well maintained but clearly showed its age. The paint had faded slightly. There was a small dent in the rear bumper. It looked exactly like what it was, a car owned by someone who needed reliable transportation but couldn't afford anything fancy. The valet who approached it looked confused, glancing back at his supervisor as if to ask whether this car was supposed to be here or if it had gotten lost and ended up at the wrong entrance. But before he could say anything, the driver's door opened, and Grace stepped out. The valet froze. Grace was not wearing rags. She was not wearing her cleaning uniform, as Edward's friends had joked she would. She was not dressed in anything borrowed or cheap or inappropriate. She wore the deep navy dress that Maria's mother had made, and it transformed her. The dress was simple but elegant, flattering without trying too hard, dignified without being stuffy. Her hair, usually pulled back in a severe bun, was styled softly, pulled back but with gentle waves framing her face. She wore minimal makeup, just enough to highlight her features. And on her right hand, clearly visible, she wore the ring. The gold ring with the Harrington family crest engraved on its face. Grace handed her keys to the stunned valet, who took them automatically, still staring. She thanked him quietly and turned toward the entrance. For just a moment, she paused, looking up at the hotel, at the lights and the grandeur and the display of wealth. Her hands trembled slightly, and she took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then she walked forward, climbing the red-carpeted steps with her head high and her shoulders back. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply walked, and there was something about the way she moved, about the quiet dignity she carried, that made people notice. A photographer who had been bored, taking the same repetitive shots of wealthy people pretending to be surprised by cameras, suddenly raised his camera and started shooting. There was something different about this woman. Something interesting. Something that his professional instincts told him was newsworthy, even though he couldn't have explained why. Inside the ballroom entrance, Grace was greeted by a young woman with a clipboard checking names against the guest list. The woman looked up, saw Grace, and her professionally pleasant expression faltered for just a second. She had heard the rumors about the maid being invited as a joke. She had heard the kitchen staff talking about it, laughing about it, wondering if Grace would actually show up. And now here she was, this woman they had all been gossiping about, and she didn't look like a joke. She looked, the woman thought with surprise, dignified. "Name, please?" the woman with the clipboard asked, her voice slightly uncertain. "Grace," came the quiet reply. "Grace Harrington." The woman's eyes widened. She looked down at her list, found the name Grace, just Grace, no last name listed. She looked back up, confused, but Grace had already moved past her, walking into the ballroom. The room didn't go quiet all at once. That only happens in movies. Instead, the silence spread in waves, like ripples in water. The first people to notice were those standing near the entrance, people who turned at the sound of new arrival and saw Grace. Their conversation stuttered, paused, stopped. They stared, and their staring made others turn to look, and soon there was a growing circle of attention focused on this woman who didn't belong, this woman who was walking through their world like she had every right to be there. Whispers started, soft at first, then growing louder. "Is that her? Is that the maid? What is she doing here? Why does she look like that? Is that the Harrington crest on her ring?" The whispers spread faster than the silence, jumping from group to group, table to table, spreading through the room like wildfire. Edward was in the middle of a conversation with a senator when someone touched his arm and whispered urgently, "Edward, the maid is here." He turned, following the direction of everyone's stares, and saw Grace. For a moment, just a brief moment, his confident expression faltered. This wasn't what he had expected. He had expected her to show up in her work clothes, or at best in some ill-fitting borrowed dress, looking uncomfortable and out of place, providing entertainment and a lesson about class and status. But this woman walking through his ballroom, this woman holding herself with such calm dignity, this wasn't what he had planned. He felt something he rarely felt, uncertainty. It passed quickly, replaced by irritation and defensiveness. This was still his party. His night. She was still just the maid, no matter what she was wearing. He forced his smile back into place and moved toward her, determined to take control of the situation. Grace stood near the center of the ballroom now, not moving toward any particular destination, just standing, waiting. She could feel every eye on her. She could hear the whispers, some curious, some mocking, some confused. She recognized many of the faces in this room. She had served these people. She had cleaned their houses when they came to visit Edward. She had poured their coffee and cleared their plates and listened to their conversations while they forgot she was human enough to hear. And now she was standing in front of them, not as a servant, but as something else. Something they didn't understand yet. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but her face remained calm. She had practiced this. She had prepared for this. She was ready. Edward reached her, his smile tight and false. "Grace," he said loudly enough for nearby people to hear, his tone condescending. "I'm surprised you came. And so, dressed up. How nice." There was barely concealed mockery in his voice, an invitation for others to join in the joke. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in 15 years, she didn't lower her eyes. She met his gaze directly and said, clearly and calmly, "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Harrington. Or should I say, thank you, Edward." After all, we are family. The room, which had been filled with whispers, went completely silent. Edward's smile froze on his face. What did you say? Grace didn't repeat herself. She simply stood there, waiting, watching him process her words, watching confusion turn to suspicion turn to the first flicker of fear. Dinner was announced, and people moved reluctantly to their assigned tables, still craning their necks to look at Grace, still whispering urgently to each other about what she had said and what it might mean. Edward, shaken but trying to regain control, returned to the head table where his family and closest friends were seated. Grace had not been assigned a table in the original seating arrangements, of course. The invitation had been a joke, and no one had actually expected her to come. But a waiter, sensing the tension and not wanting to cause a scene, quickly set up an additional place at a table near the back, away from the head table but still visible to most of the room. Grace thanked him and sat down, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. The people at her table, wealthy donors and business associates of Edward's, looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, unsure whether to speak to her or ignore her. The meal was served in courses, each one elaborate and carefully presented. Appetizers of seared scallops and microgreens. Soup that had been prepared by a chef who had 3 Michelin stars. Salads with edible flowers and dressings made from ingredients most people had never heard of. The main course was a choice between filet mignon or Chilean sea bass, both cooked to perfection. And throughout it all, Grace ate quietly, using the correct silverware without hesitation, moving through the formal dinner with the ease of someone who had been raised in this world. Because she had been. Before her father's death, before the money disappeared, before her life became about survival, Grace had grown up in a world not unlike this one. She had attended formal dinners. She had been taught proper etiquette. She knew which fork to use. And watching her, several people at nearby tables began to feel the first stirrings of doubt. This woman didn't act like someone who was out of her depth. She acted like someone who belonged here. Like someone who was simply reclaiming her rightful place. At the head table, Edward was barely eating. He kept glancing toward Grace, his mind working, trying to understand what she had meant, what game she was playing. His wife Margaret leaned toward him and whispered, "What did she mean by, 'we are family'? Edward, what is going on?" He shook his head, dismissing her concern. "Nothing. She's confused, or she's trying to cause trouble. Don't worry about it." But he was worried. Something about Grace tonight was different. Something about the way she carried herself, the way she had looked at him, the confidence in her voice when she claimed they were family. It triggered a memory, something from long ago, something his father had told him to forget. A brother. Jonathan. The brother who had died before Edward was old enough to remember him clearly. The brother whose company Edward's father had taken over, building it into the empire it was today. Edward had always been told it was a tragic accident, that his father had stepped in to save the company, that it was a legitimate inheritance. But now, looking at Grace, he felt the first cold touch of doubt. After dinner, dessert was served, an elaborate construction of chocolate and raspberry and edible gold leaf that looked almost too beautiful to eat. And then Edward stood to give his speech. The room quieted, attention focusing on him. This was his moment, the moment he had been planning, when he would thank everyone for coming and remind them all of his journey, his success, his importance. He stood at the podium that had been set up near the head table, adjusted the microphone, and began. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about his journey, starting from modest beginnings, his voice carefully emphasizing the word modest as if he had come from poverty rather than comfortable middle-class wealth. He talked about building his empire through hard work and determination. He talked about the responsibility that came with success, the duty to give back, to mentor others, to be an example. He talked for 15 minutes, and people listened politely, applauding at the right moments, laughing at his carefully timed jokes. And through it all, Grace sat at her table in the back, watching him, her face revealing nothing. When Edward finished and the applause died down, there was a moment of expectation. The evening would continue with dancing and more drinks and conversations that would stretch late into the night. But before the music could start, before people could stand and move toward the bar or the dance floor, Grace stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't make a scene. She simply stood, and somehow, that simple action drew every eye in the room. Edward, who had just sat down, looked up and saw her standing. His face paled. Grace began walking toward the front of the room, toward the podium where Edward had just spoken. People watched, confused, uncertain. Was this part of the program? Had Edward planned some additional entertainment? The room fell silent again, that heavy, expectant silence that precedes something important. Grace reached the podium and stood next to it, not behind it. She didn't presume to take Edward's place. She simply stood where everyone could see her, and she waited until she was certain she had everyone's attention. Then she began to speak. Her voice was quiet but clear, steady despite the fear and anger and grief swirling inside her. "My name," she said, "is Grace. Many of you know me as the maid who works in the Harrington mansion. But that is not my complete name. My full name is Grace Harrington. I am the daughter of Jonathan Harrington, Edward's uncle, the man who founded the company that became the Harrington Empire." The room erupted. Gasps, exclamations, people turning to each other in shock. Edward surged to his feet, his face red. "This is absurd," he shouted. This is some kind of scam. I don't know what you think you're doing, but," his voice was cut off by another voice, firm and strong, coming from the back of the room. "She's telling the truth." Everyone turned. An elderly man was standing, leaning slightly on a cane, his face stern and sad. It was Charles Whitmore, the man who had been Jonathan's business partner. The witness David Chen had arranged to be present. Charles walked slowly toward the front of the room, and people parted to let him through. There was respect in how they moved aside. Charles was old money, from a family everyone recognized, and his presence here, his support of Grace's claim, carried weight. He reached Grace and stood beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I knew Jonathan Harrington," Charles said, his voice carrying despite his age. "I worked with him. I watched him build a steel company from nothing, through sheer determination and brilliance. And I watched his younger brother Robert, Edward's father, convince Jonathan to sign over temporary control of the company. I watched Robert promise to take care of Jonathan's family if anything ever happened to him. And I watched and did nothing, when Jonathan died under suspicious circumstances and Robert took complete control, erasing Jonathan from the company history and cutting off his family without a cent." The room was completely silent now, the kind of silence where you could hear people breathing, where the clink of someone's wine glass being set down sounded like a gunshot. Charles continued, tears now visible on his weathered face. "I was a coward. I was afraid of what Robert might do if I spoke up. I was afraid of losing my own business, my own position. So I stayed quiet. And I have lived with that guilt for 30 years. But I am not afraid anymore. And I will not stay quiet any longer. Grace is Jonathan's daughter. She is the rightful heir to the company her father built. And every day she worked in that mansion, cleaning Edward's floors, she was serving a man who was living off her father's stolen legacy." Charles pulled papers from his jacket pocket, documents he had kept all these years, documents detailing the transfer of power, the circumstances of Jonathan's death, the financial manipulations that followed. Edward was standing now, speechless, his face cycling through colors, white to red to purple. His lawyer, sitting at a nearby table, was frantically whispering into his phone, calling the firm, summoning help. People in the crowd were pulling out their own phones, recording, taking pictures, posting to social media. This was no longer a private party. This was news. This was scandal. This was the kind of story that would dominate headlines for weeks. Margaret had stood and moved away from the head table, her face carefully blank, already distancing herself. The children looked shocked, confused, trying to process what this meant for them. And Grace stood at the front of the room, calm in the center of the storm, watching it all unfold. "I have evidence," Grace said, her voice still quiet but firm. "I have my father's original will, which clearly states that his shares in the company were to be held in trust for his children. I have DNA test results proving my relationship to Jonathan Harrington. I have testimony from multiple witnesses who were present during the transfer of power and the aftermath of my father's death. I have bank records showing how assets that should have gone to my father's estate were diverted. I have everything." She pulled a folder from a small bag she had brought with her, holding it up for everyone to see. "But I didn't come here just to prove my identity or to reclaim what was stolen. I came here because for 15 years, I have watched Edward Harrington. I have listened to him talk about how the poor are poor because they deserve it, how people like me are at the bottom because we're lazy or stupid or unambitious. I have listened to him and his friends mock people who work for them, people who clean their houses and serve their food and make their comfortable lives possible." Grace's voice grew stronger, emotion finally seeping through despite her efforts to remain calm. "I have watched him donate money to charity, not because he cares about helping others, but because he enjoys hearing his name announced. I have watched him treat his employees like property, firing them without cause, denying them benefits, fighting against fair wages. I have watched him ignore his own children, turning them into competitors for his approval rather than loving them unconditionally. And I have wondered, every single day, how a man who built everything on theft, who owes everything to my father's vision and work, could be so proud, so arrogant, so utterly convinced of his own superiority. So I want everyone in this room to understand something. The empire you've been celebrating tonight, the success you've been admiring, the man you've been honoring, is built on a lie. Built on betrayal. Built on stolen dreams and erased legacy. My father's dreams. My family's legacy." The room remained frozen, everyone processing what they were hearing, what it meant. Some people looked ashamed, realizing they had participated in celebrating something rotten. Others looked angry, feeling manipulated or lied to. Still others looked calculating, already thinking about how to distance themselves from Edward, how to protect their own interests and reputations. Edward himself had collapsed back into his chair, his face now gray, his hands shaking. His lawyer was still on the phone, but even he looked defeated, understanding that this wasn't something that could be made to disappear quietly, not with this many witnesses, not with this much evidence, not with social media already spreading the story around the world. Grace looked around the room, meeting eyes, making sure her message landed. Then she said, "I am not here for revenge. I am not here to destroy Edward's life the way his father destroyed mine. I am here for truth. And now that the truth is known, now that it can't be hidden or denied anymore, we can decide what justice looks like. Real justice. Not the justice of the powerful protecting themselves, but the justice that serves everyone, even those the world has forgotten." The ballroom erupted into chaos. People surged forward, some wanting to speak to Grace, others to Edward, still others simply trying to leave before they got pulled into the scandal. Reporters who had been covering the party as a society event suddenly realized they had a much bigger story and were shouting questions, pushing through the crowd. Security guards, confused and overwhelmed, tried to maintain some kind of order but were largely ineffective. Edward's lawyer finally ended his phone call and rushed to Edward's side, whispering urgently, probably advising him not to say anything, not to make any statements without careful legal preparation. But Edward wasn't listening. He was staring at Grace with a mixture of hatred and disbelief, his whole world crumbling around him, everything he thought he knew about himself and his life revealed as a lie. Margaret approached Grace, and people made room, curious to see what the wife would say. Margaret's face was hard to read, but when she spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled. "How long have you known?" she asked. Grace met her eyes. "I've always known who my father was. But I've only known for certain about the betrayal, only had proof, for about 3 years. Before that, it was family stories, suspicions, fragments of truth that I couldn't prove." Margaret nodded slowly. "And you worked in our house, all those years, knowing?" Yes, Grace said simply. Margaret was silent for a long moment, then said, I don't know if what you're saying is true. I don't know what really happened 30 years ago. But I know Edward. I know the kind of man he is. And I know that he's capable of believing his own lies, of convincing himself that whatever benefits him must be true and right. If your father did build that company, if Edward's father did betray him, then I'm not surprised Edward never told me. I'm not sure he even knows. His father probably died keeping that secret, letting Edward believe he had earned everything. She paused, then added quietly, I'm sorry for what you've endured. Working in our home, serving us, knowing what you knew. I can't imagine that kind of strength. Edward finally found his voice. I'm not going to stand here and be accused of, I didn't do anything wrong. Whatever my father did, if he did anything, that was him, not me. I built this company into what it is today. I expanded it. I made it successful. You can't just come in here and, I'm not taking anything from you that was ever yours, Grace interrupted, her voice still calm but firm. The company will be audited. The legal matters will be sorted out. But Edward, you need to understand something. You didn't build this from nothing. You built it from something my father created. Every opportunity you had, every door that opened for you, every advantage you enjoyed, came because of the foundation my father laid. And you've spent your life believing you deserved all of it while people like me, people you considered beneath you, were actually the ones with more claim to everything you have than you ever did. That's not revenge. That's just truth. And truth doesn't care about your feelings or your pride. Catherine, Edward's daughter, pushed through the crowd and stood next to Grace, shocking everyone, especially Edward. She's right, Catherine said, her voice shaking but determined. I've spent my whole life watching my father treat people like they're less than human if they have less money than him. I've watched him ignore us, his own children, unless we were useful for his image. I've watched him donate to charities while fighting against minimum wage increases for his own employees. And I've always wondered, what gives him the right? What makes him so special? And now I know. Nothing. Nothing except theft and lies and a legacy that was never his to claim. Edward looked at his daughter with betrayal written across his face. Catherine, how can you? Because it's true, Dad, she said, tears now streaming down her face. Because I'm tired of pretending. Because maybe, for once in our lives, this family should actually stand for something honest. Edward Jr. stepped forward, his face hard. Catherine, you don't know what you're talking about. This woman is clearly running some kind of scam, and you're falling for it. Dad, we need to shut this down. Call the police. Have her arrested for fraud or defamation or, on what grounds, a new voice interrupted. David Chen, Grace's lawyer, had been sitting quietly at a table near the back, but now he stood, holding up his phone. I've been recording everything. I have multiple witnesses. I have documentation that will stand up in any court. You can call the police if you want, but I promise you, they'll be very interested in examining the evidence of fraud and embezzlement that I'll present. Edward Harrington may not have known the full truth about how his father acquired the company, but he certainly knew enough to ask questions he chose not to ask. And over the past 15 years, he's made decisions that benefited him at the expense of the rightful heirs. That's not inheritance. That's continued theft. The room buzzed with conversations, arguments, debates. Some people were defending Edward, friends and business partners whose own interests were tied to his, who needed him to be innocent because if he wasn't, what did that say about them, about their own successes and how they had achieved them? Others were condemning him, distancing themselves, announcing loudly that they had always had doubts about Edward, had always felt something wasn't quite right, rewriting their own histories to protect themselves. Still others were silent, thinking, trying to process everything they had heard and seen, trying to decide what they believed and what it meant. And in the center of it all, Grace stood quiet and still, having said what she needed to say, having revealed the truth she had carried for so long. She felt lighter somehow, despite the chaos around her. The weight of 15 years of secret knowledge, of patient waiting, of silent service, had been lifted. Whatever happened next, the truth was out. It couldn't be buried again. Frank, the driver, appeared at Grace's side, having been waiting in the parking area. He had heard the commotion and come inside. "You need to leave," he said quietly. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. Let me drive you home." Grace nodded gratefully. She gathered her things, the folder of evidence, the small bag, and allowed Frank to guide her toward a side exit. As they walked, people reached out to her, some to thank her, some to apologize, some just to touch her as if she were something holy, a martyr or a saint. She accepted it all with quiet grace, never stopping, never engaging too deeply, just moving steadily toward the exit and away from the chaos she had created. Behind her, she heard Edward's voice, loud and angry, still protesting, still denying, but the conviction was gone from his voice. He knew. Deep down, he had always known there was something wrong with his family's story, something too convenient about how his father had ended up with complete control of a company his brother had founded. He had just chosen not to look too closely, chosen to accept the comfortable lie rather than confront the uncomfortable truth. And now he was paying the price for that willful ignorance. Outside, the night air was cool and fresh after the oppressive atmosphere of the ballroom. Grace paused on the steps, breathing deeply, feeling the tension slowly drain from her body. Camera flashes erupted around her as photographers who had been waiting outside, alerted by social media posts from inside, swarmed forward. Questions were shouted from all directions. "Grace. Is it true you're Jonathan Harrington's daughter? How long have you been planning this? What do you want from Edward Harrington? Are you going to take over the company?" Frank positioned himself between Grace and the photographers, his solid presence providing a shield. "No comment," he said firmly. "Ms. Harrington has said what she needed to say. Any further statements will come through her lawyer." He guided Grace to his car, the same modest Honda she had arrived in, and helped her into the passenger seat. As they pulled away from the Grand Regency, Grace looked back once at the hotel, at the lights and the chaos visible through the windows, at the world she had just shattered. She felt no triumph. No joy. Just a deep, bone-tired relief that it was finally over. That she had finally kept her promise to her mother, to her father's memory. That the truth was finally known. The drive back was quiet. Frank didn't ask questions, didn't offer commentary, just drove carefully through the city streets while Grace stared out the window. When they reached the mansion, he pulled up to the staff entrance where Grace had entered and exited thousands of times over 15 years. But this time felt different. Grace turned to Frank. "Thank you," she said. "For the letter. For driving me tonight. For believing me." Frank's eyes were wet. "I should have done it years ago," he said. "I should have been brave like you. But thank you for giving me a chance to finally do the right thing." Grace squeezed his hand and got out of the car. She walked to her small room, the one with the peeling wallpaper and the broken window, and sat on her narrow bed. She was still wearing the beautiful navy dress. Her feet ached in the simple but elegant shoes Maria had lent her. And she was exhausted, more exhausted than she had ever been, even after the longest days of work. But she couldn't sleep. Not yet. So she sat in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her, and waited for whatever came next. By morning, the story had exploded. It was on every news site, every social media platform, trending worldwide. "Billionaire's fortune built on stolen legacy," screamed one headline. "Maid reveals she's rightful heir to Harrington Empire," announced another. "Cinderella story or scandal? Grace Harrington's shocking revelation," asked a third. The story had everything the media loved: wealth, betrayal, a dramatic revelation at a society event, a protagonist who had suffered in silence for years. Grace's face was everywhere, screenshots from videos that guests had posted, photos the event photographers had taken, all showing this dignified woman in her navy dress standing at the front of that ballroom speaking truth to power. The contrast between her obvious poverty and her quiet dignity, between Edward's obvious wealth and his exposed corruption, made for compelling visuals and even more compelling narrative. The mansion was in chaos when Grace emerged from her room at dawn. Staff members were gathered in small groups, whispering, showing each other their phones, looking at Grace with new eyes when she appeared. Some looked at her with awe. Some with disbelief. Some with fear about what this meant for their own jobs, their own security. Maria rushed to Grace and hugged her tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it. You were so brave." Other staff members approached, wanting to hear the full story, wanting to understand how this had happened, how the quiet maid they had worked alongside for years had been carrying such a secret. Grace answered their questions as best she could, explaining that yes, it was all true, yes, she had known for a long time, and no, she didn't know what would happen next, to the mansion, to their jobs, to any of them. Edward did not come home that night. His lawyer had whisked him away from the Grand Regency and taken him to an undisclosed location, probably a hotel, somewhere he could hide from the media circus. Margaret returned to the mansion around 3 in the morning, looking exhausted and shell-shocked. She went straight to her wing of the house and locked the door, refusing to speak to anyone. Catherine came home around the same time, still crying, and sought out Grace immediately. "I meant what I said in there," Catherine told Grace. "I meant every word. My father has been terrible to so many people for so long. And if what you're saying is true, if he built everything on something stolen from your family, then he doesn't deserve any of it." She paused, then asked, "What happens now? To us? To the house? To the company?" Grace shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "There will be legal proceedings. Investigations. Audits. It could take months or even years to sort out. But Catherine, I want you to know, I'm not trying to destroy your family. I'm trying to restore my father's legacy and get justice for what was stolen. Whatever happens, it will be decided by law, by evidence, by truth. Not by revenge." The media camped outside the mansion gates by sunrise. News vans lined the street. Reporters stood in front of cameras, doing live broadcasts with the mansion visible behind them. Helicopters flew overhead, trying to get aerial shots. The police had to be called to manage the crowd and ensure no one tried to climb the fence or force their way onto the property. Inside, the phone rang constantly until someone finally unplugged it. Staff members' phones buzzed with calls from reporters offering money for inside information, for photos, for anything that could add to the story. Grace's phone, an old basic model she had used for years, had somehow had its number leaked, and it too rang incessantly until she turned it off completely. The attention was overwhelming, suffocating, exactly what Grace had known would happen but had still not been fully prepared for. David Chen arrived at the mansion by mid-morning, fighting his way through the media crowd with the help of security. He met with Grace in a small office that staff sometimes used for household management. "You did beautifully last night," he told her. "Everything you said, the way you presented yourself, the evidence you offered, it was perfect. The legal team for Harrington Industries has already reached out. They want to meet, want to negotiate. They know they can't win this in court, not with the evidence we have, not with witnesses like Charles Whitmore willing to testify. But Grace, I need you to understand, this is just the beginning. The legal process will be long and complicated. There will be depositions, audits, hearings, possibly trials if Edward decides to fight. The media attention will continue, probably get worse before it gets better. Your life will never be private again. People will dig into your past, your family, everything. Are you prepared for that? Can you handle that?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, thinking about what David was asking, about what lay ahead. Finally, she said, "I've spent 15 years scrubbing floors and biting my tongue and watching a man parade around in glory that belonged to my father. I've buried a husband and a son. I've survived poverty and grief and indignity that would have broken most people. Yes, the next months or years will be hard. Yes, the attention will be invasive and exhausting. But David, I've already survived the hardest thing, which was knowing the truth and staying silent. Speaking the truth, living in the truth, even with all the complications that come with it, that's actually easier. So yes, I can handle it. I will handle it. Because the alternative is going back to silence, and I won't do that. I can't do that. Not anymore. David smiled, his eyes shining with respect and admiration. Then let's get to work, he said. Let's make sure your father's legacy is restored and your family finally gets the justice you deserve. The first official meeting happened 3 days later, in a conference room at David's law firm. Edward's legal team, 5 lawyers in expensive suits carrying expensive briefcases, sat on one side of a long table. Grace, wearing simple but neat clothes, sat on the other side with David and 2 other lawyers he had brought onto the case. The atmosphere was tense, hostile on Edward's side, determined on Grace's. Edward's lead attorney, a man named Harrison Beaumont who had a reputation for ruthlessness and winning cases for wealthy clients no matter how guilty they were, opened by attempting to intimidate. Ms. Harrington, if that's even your real name, you've made some very serious accusations against my client. Accusations that have damaged his reputation, his business, his family. We're prepared to pursue defamation charges, emotional distress, any number of claims that will tie you up in court for years and cost you more money than you've ever seen. However, my client is a generous man. He's willing to make this go away quietly. We're prepared to offer you a settlement. A substantial settlement. Enough money that you'll never have to work again. All you have to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement, admit that your claims were exaggerated or mistaken, and disappear from public life. Grace stared at Harrison for a long moment, her face expressionless. Then she said, quietly but firmly, no. Harrison blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct and immediate rejection. Ms. Harrington, perhaps you don't understand. We're talking about millions of dollars. More money than someone in your position could. I understand perfectly, Grace interrupted. You're offering me money to lie. To say that everything I revealed was false or exaggerated. To let Edward continue living a lie and profiting from my father's stolen legacy. And I'm telling you no. No amount of money will make me do that. I didn't speak up after 15 years of silence so I could be bought off and silenced again. I spoke up because the truth matters. Because my father deserves to be remembered for what he actually built. Because justice matters more than money. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes hard. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to examine the evidence my lawyers will provide. You're going to see the will, the DNA tests, the financial records, the testimony from witnesses. And you're going to realize that you cannot win this case. And then you're going to come back to this table with a real offer, one that includes public acknowledgement of what happened, restoration of my father's name, and fair compensation for what was stolen. Or we'll go to court, and I'll spend whatever time it takes to make sure the truth is established legally and publicly. The room was silent. Harrison's expression had shifted from condescending confidence to respect and maybe a little fear. He glanced at his colleagues, then back at Grace. We'll need time to review the evidence, he said, his tone much more professional now. We'll be in touch. The meeting ended, and as Grace and David left the conference room, David was grinning. That was perfect, he said. You just let them know they're not dealing with someone they can manipulate or intimidate. They'll take you seriously now. They'll negotiate in good faith because they know you're not going to back down. Grace nodded, but she felt no joy in it. This wasn't a game to her. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was about finally, after 30 years of lies, getting her family's story told correctly. Over the following weeks, more information came to light. Investigative journalists, sensing a major story, started digging into the Harrington family history. They found records of Jonathan Harrington's early business ventures, interviews he had given to local papers about his vision for the steel industry, photographs of him at construction sites with blueprints in hand. They found the police report from his death, which had been ruled an accident but which contained inconsistencies that had never been followed up on. They found former employees of the company who remembered Jonathan, who spoke glowingly of him as a boss and a visionary, and who had always wondered what happened to his family after he died. They found financial experts who analyzed the company's growth and concluded that the foundation had been laid by Jonathan, that the initial success and reputation that later allowed for expansion had been his achievement, and that Robert and later Edward had simply built upon that foundation while taking all the credit. Public opinion, initially divided, began to shift heavily in Grace's favor. Her story resonated with people. The image of her working as a maid in the house that should have been partly hers, serving the man who was living off her father's stolen legacy, was powerful. People admired her patience, her dignity, her refusal to be bought off. Social media was filled with posts supporting her, calling her an inspiration, sharing her story as an example of how truth eventually comes to light no matter how long it's buried. There were dissenters, of course. Edward had his defenders, people who believed he was being unfairly attacked for something his father had done, people who thought Grace should have handled this through quiet legal channels instead of making a public spectacle. But they were outnumbered by those who saw this as a story of justice finally being served, of the powerful being held accountable, of the forgotten being remembered. The legal process moved faster than expected, partly because Edward's lawyers, after reviewing the evidence, advised him that fighting this in court would be a losing battle that would cost him everything. The DNA evidence alone was irrefutable. Grace was definitively Jonathan Harrington's daughter. The will was authenticated by multiple experts as genuine, not a forgery. The financial records showed clear manipulation of assets after Jonathan's death. And the testimony from Charles Whitmore and other witnesses provided context that made the pattern of theft undeniable. Edward could fight, drag it out for years, spend millions on legal fees, but he would lose. And in the process, more damaging information would likely come out, more details about how he had run the company, how he had treated employees, how he had maintained the cover-up even if he hadn't initiated it. His lawyers convinced him that negotiation was the only viable option. The settlement negotiations took 2 months. It was complicated, involving not just the transfer of assets but also the restructuring of the entire company. Grace, through her lawyers, was clear about what she wanted. First, public acknowledgement of what had happened. Edward had to release a statement admitting that his father had taken control of the company from Jonathan through deception and manipulation, that Jonathan was the true founder and visionary behind Harrington Industries, and that Grace was Jonathan's daughter and rightful heir. Second, restoration of her father's name. The company would be renamed Harrington Grace Industries, acknowledging both the past and the future. Jonathan's contributions would be documented in the company's official history, his photographs displayed in the corporate headquarters, his story told accurately. Third, fair compensation. Grace would receive 51% controlling interest in the company, along with back payment of dividends she should have inherited over the past 30 years, calculated with interest. The amount was staggering, hundreds of millions of dollars, enough to make Grace one of the wealthiest women in the state. But Grace also insisted on conditions about how the company would be run going forward. Worker wages would be reviewed and adjusted to fair market rates with regular increases tied to inflation and company performance. Benefits would be expanded to include better healthcare, retirement plans, and paid family leave. A foundation would be established in Jonathan Harrington's name, dedicated to supporting families affected by workplace accidents and providing scholarships for children who had lost parents. The company would commit to ethical business practices, transparency in financial dealings, and community investment in the regions where it operated. Edward's lawyers pushed back on some of these demands, arguing they went beyond fair restitution, but Grace was unmovable. "My father built this company not just to make money but to provide good jobs and contribute to his community," she said. "If I'm going to restore his legacy, I'm going to restore his values too. These conditions are non-negotiable." Edward fought the hardest against the requirement for public acknowledgement. His ego couldn't accept it. His identity was so wrapped up in being a self-made success, in believing he had earned everything through his own merit, that admitting the truth felt like death. He raged at his lawyers, threatened to fire them, insisted there had to be another way. But there wasn't. Not unless he wanted to lose everything in court and face potential criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Finally, broken and bitter, he agreed. The statement was released on a Tuesday morning, and it was front-page news everywhere. Edward Harrington admitted that his father had acquired control of Harrington Industries through deception, that Jonathan Harrington was the true founder, and that Grace Harrington was Jonathan's daughter and rightful heir. He apologized, though the words were clearly written by lawyers and felt hollow, for any pain this situation had caused, and pledged to cooperate fully with the transition of leadership. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Some people felt vindicated, seeing this as proof that justice could prevail even against the powerful. Others felt uncomfortable, forced to confront the fact that many fortunes, maybe even their own, were built on questionable foundations. Edward's former friends and business associates scrambled to distance themselves from him. Invitations dried up. Board positions were quietly withdrawn. People who had laughed at his jokes and courted his favor suddenly couldn't remember his name. He became, almost overnight, a pariah in the social circles he had dominated for decades. His wife Margaret filed for divorce within a week of the statement being released, citing irreconcilable differences and a prenuptial agreement that protected her own family's assets. His children had mixed reactions. Edward Jr., who had been groomed to take over the company, was furious and refused to speak to his father. Michael, the middle child who had always felt overshadowed and unappreciated, felt a strange relief that the family myth had been shattered. And Catherine reached out to Grace, asking if they could talk, wanting to understand more about Jonathan, about the history she had never been taught. Grace officially took control of the company 4 months after the gala. There was a press conference, cameras and reporters, and questions shouted from all directions. Grace, dressed professionally but simply in a navy blue suit that echoed the dress she had worn that night, stood at a podium with the company logo, newly redesigned to include her father's name, displayed behind her. She spoke clearly and calmly about her plans for the company, about honoring her father's memory while moving forward responsibly, about making Harrington Grace Industries a model for how companies should treat their employees and communities. She fielded questions for 30 minutes, never losing her composure, never showing anything but quiet determination and dignity. When one reporter asked if she felt vindicated, she paused, then said, "I don't feel vindicated. I feel sad. Sad that it took 30 years for the truth to come out. Sad that my father never got to see what his company became. Sad that so many people were hurt by lies that should never have been told. But I also feel hopeful. Hopeful that we can build something better from this. Hopeful that truth and justice, even when they're delayed, still matter." Edward, meanwhile, had largely disappeared from public life. He had been forced to sell most of his personal assets to cover legal fees and settlement obligations. The mansion was sold to cover debts. The vacation homes were liquidated. The private jet, the yacht, the luxury cars, all sold. He moved to a modest apartment in a different city, trying to start over away from the judgmental eyes of people who had once celebrated him. Some reports suggested he was drinking heavily. Others claimed he was seeing a therapist, finally confronting the reality of who he had been and what he had done. His relationship with his children was fractured, possibly beyond repair. Edward Jr. wouldn't take his calls. Michael sent occasional brief text messages but refused to visit. Only Catherine maintained any real contact, though even she kept her distance, needing space to process her own feelings about her father and her family history. The company underwent massive changes under Grace's leadership. She promoted several longtime employees into management positions, people who knew the business from the ground up and who shared her values. She instituted the wage increases and benefit improvements she had insisted on in the settlement. She established the Jonathan Harrington Foundation with an initial endowment of $50 million, ensuring it would be able to help families for generations. She met personally with workers at various facilities, listening to their concerns, asking for their input, treating them with the respect and dignity that had been missing under Edward's leadership. Productivity actually increased despite the higher labor costs, as workers felt valued and invested in the company's success. Profits remained strong, proving that treating people fairly and running a business successfully were not mutually exclusive goals. Grace also made sure her father's story was told completely and accurately. She commissioned a biography, working closely with the author to ensure every detail was correct, providing access to documents and photographs and interviews with people who had known Jonathan. The book became a bestseller, inspiring readers with the story of a visionary who had built something meaningful only to have it stolen, and of his daughter who had waited patiently for 30 years to restore his legacy. Grace gave interviews sparingly, uncomfortable with celebrity but understanding that her story had meaning for people beyond just her family. She spoke about patience, about truth, about the importance of treating every person with dignity regardless of their economic status or job title. She became, somewhat reluctantly, a symbol of perseverance and justice. The transition from Maid to CEO was jarring in ways Grace hadn't fully anticipated. Suddenly she had more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. Suddenly people who would have walked past her without seeing her 6 months ago were competing for her attention, her approval, her time. Suddenly she was living in a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that was actually comfortable, eating meals prepared by a personal chef, wearing clothes that fit properly and weren't worn thin from years of use. The physical comfort was welcome after so many years of struggle, but it also felt strange, almost wrong sometimes. Grace found herself missing the simplicity of her old life, the clarity of purpose that came from just trying to survive day to day. Now her days were filled with meetings and decisions that affected thousands of people, with responsibilities that weighed heavily despite her determination to handle them well. She struggled with the wealth especially. The first time she checked her bank balance after the settlement payments came through, seeing those numbers, Grace had to sit down, feeling dizzy. It was more money than her father had ever made, more than she had imagined possible. And it came from her father's work, from something that should have supported her family all along, that could have saved James, that could have given her mother comfort in her final years. The bitterness of that realization, that this money had existed all along while she struggled and suffered and lost people she loved, was hard to process. Grace met with a therapist, something she had never been able to afford before, and worked through the complicated emotions of grief and anger and guilt that came with her new circumstances. The therapist helped her understand that feeling guilty about having money now didn't dishonor those she had lost, that she could accept comfort and security without forgetting suffering, that moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past. Grace used her wealth carefully and thoughtfully. She paid off Maria's student loans as a thank you for the dress and the kindness. She set up a generous pension for Frank, ensuring he could retire comfortably whenever he was ready. She tracked down other people who had helped her over the years, former co-workers who had shared their lunches, landlords who had been patient with late rent, teachers who had supported James, and she found ways to help them, always quietly, never wanting recognition or gratitude. She donated to causes that mattered to her, organizations that provided healthcare to those who couldn't afford it, groups that supported workers' rights, programs that helped children from low-income families access education. But she did it all anonymously when possible, not wanting to become one of those wealthy people who donated for recognition rather than impact. The company thrived under her leadership in ways that surprised even her supporters. Grace had worried that her lack of business training, her years away from any kind of corporate environment, would make her ineffective as CEO. But she discovered that her years of observation, of watching Edward and other executives, of listening to conversations and noticing patterns, had taught her more than she realized. And more importantly, her values, her genuine care for the people who worked for her, created a culture that attracted talent and inspired loyalty. When positions opened up, they received applications from some of the best people in the industry, people who wanted to work for a company that was trying to do things differently, trying to prove that success and ethics weren't incompatible. Grace surrounded herself with experts, people who knew more than her about specific aspects of running a large corporation, but she made the final decisions based on her values and vision, and those decisions proved sound more often than not. She also reconnected with extended family she had lost touch with over the years. Cousins and aunts and uncles who had drifted away during her years of poverty reached out, some genuinely happy for her success, others clearly hoping for financial benefits. Grace was careful about who she let back into her life, but she also tried to be generous with family members who were struggling, helping with medical bills or education costs or business loans, though always with clear boundaries and expectations. She attended family gatherings for the first time in decades, weddings and graduations and holiday dinners, feeling strange and out of place among people who remembered her as the poor relation and now didn't know how to treat her as someone successful. But she made the effort because family had always mattered to her, even when it had been painful to be around relatives who had more than she did. Catherine Harrington, or Catherine as she now preferred to be called, dropping the Harrington Association in unofficial contexts, became an unexpected friend. The two women met regularly, sometimes for business since Catherine had some financial interest in the company through family trusts, but more often just for coffee or lunch or walks in the park. Catherine was processing her own complicated feelings about her father, about the family legacy that had turned out to be built on theft and lies, about the wealth she had enjoyed her whole life that she now knew had never really belonged to her family. Grace helped her work through those feelings, showing Catherine grace and understanding, refusing to blame her for her father's sins while also being honest about how Edward's behavior and values had harmed people. Their friendship was unusual, crossing generations and backgrounds and histories of conflict, but it worked. They both needed someone who understood the unique situation they were in, the strange intersection of wealth and injustice and family drama that had defined both their lives. Grace also maintained relationships with some of the people from her old life, the ones who had known her as a maid and treated her with respect anyway. She had coffee every week with a group of former housekeepers, women who still cleaned houses for wealthy families, and she listened to their stories and sometimes helped quietly when they faced problems with employers or needed support. She made sure they knew that she hadn't forgotten where she came from, that wealth hadn't changed her fundamental understanding of what it was like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be treated as less than human by people who should know better. These friendships kept her grounded, reminded her why she was doing what she was doing, kept her connected to the reality that most people lived every day. One afternoon, about a year after taking control of the company, Grace drove out to the cemetery where Thomas and James were buried. She brought flowers, which she did regularly, but this time she also brought something else, a framed photograph of her at the podium during her first press conference as CEO, with the redesigned company logo visible behind her, showing both her father's name and hers. She placed it on the ground between the two headstones and knelt there for a long time, crying quietly, talking to them the way she always did. "I did it," she whispered. "I kept my promise. Dad's name is restored. His legacy is remembered. And I'm running his company the way he would have wanted, with integrity and fairness and care for the people who work there. I wish you were here to see it. I wish James could have had the opportunities this money would have provided. I wish you could have met your grandfather, even just through the stories I've learned about him. But I hope, wherever you are, you know that I haven't forgotten you. That everything I'm doing now, I'm doing partly in your memory, partly to honor what you deserved but never got." She stayed there until the sun began to set, until the cemetery staff came by to gently remind her they would be closing soon. Then she stood, touched both headstones one more time, and walked back to her car. On the drive home, through streets that were familiar but felt different now that she wasn't struggling just to survive in them, Grace thought about justice and what it really meant. She had gotten what she came for. Her father's name was restored. Her family's stolen legacy was reclaimed. Edward had been exposed and had lost almost everything. By any measure, she had won. But it didn't feel like winning exactly. It felt more complicated than that. It felt like closing a chapter that should never have been opened, like finally being able to breathe after holding her breath for 30 years, like justice but also like sadness because justice delayed for so long had left so many casualties in its wake. Edward's fall from grace was complete and devastating. The man who had once been celebrated as a titan of industry, who had been courted by politicians and celebrities, who had believed himself to be self-made and superior to others, now found himself alone and forgotten. The apartment he rented in his new city was nice by most standards, but compared to the mansion he had lost, compared to the life he had known, it felt like a prison. He spent his days mostly alone, watching television or staring out the window, occasionally forcing himself to take walks or go to the grocery store, simple tasks that felt overwhelming when you had spent decades having other people handle every aspect of daily living for you. He had never learned to cook properly, had never done his own laundry, had never managed his own schedule. Now, at 60, he was learning these basic skills and feeling humiliated by his own incompetence. The divorce from Margaret was finalized 9 months after the scandal broke. She took what the prenuptial agreement allowed her to take, which was substantial but not devastating since most of her wealth came from her own family anyway. She made no effort to stay in touch, cutting him out of her life completely as if their 35 years of marriage had never happened. Edward understood. She had married a successful, powerful man, and he was no longer that person. She had no use for who he had become. His children's rejection hurt more, though he told himself he didn't care, that they were weak for turning against him. But late at night, when the apartment was quiet and the loneliness was crushing, he thought about them. About Catherine's angry tears at the gala. About Edward Jr.'s refusal to take his calls. About Michael's carefully polite distance. He had failed them, not just now but for their entire lives, caring more about building and maintaining his empire than about being a father to them. And now he was paying the price for that failure. Edward went through phases in his response to what had happened. At first was denial, convincing himself that this was all temporary, that he would find a way to prove Grace wrong, to reclaim what was rightfully his, to restore his position. He spent money he didn't have consulting with lawyers about potential appeals or new legal strategies, until the lawyers gently explained that there was nothing to appeal, that the evidence was definitive, that he needed to accept reality and move on. Then came anger, a deep, consuming rage at Grace for exposing him, at his father for putting him in this position, at everyone who had abandoned him or turned against him. He shouted at strangers for minor inconveniences. He broke things in his apartment, punching walls and throwing furniture. He wrote long, furious emails to people who had been his friends, blaming them for not standing by him, though he never sent the emails, deleting them after his rage cooled. After anger came depression, dark and heavy and suffocating. Edward stopped leaving his apartment except when absolutely necessary. He stopped showering regularly, stopped shaving, stopped caring about his appearance in any way. He drank heavily, working his way through bottles of whiskey that used to be celebratory luxuries but now were just ways to numb the pain and pass the time. He thought about suicide more than once, standing on his apartment balcony and looking down 6 floors to the concrete below, wondering if anyone would even care or notice if he jumped. But some combination of cowardice and stubborn pride kept him from actually doing it. He wasn't ready to give the world, to give Grace, the satisfaction of his death. So he continued existing, not really living, just breathing and sleeping and drinking and hating himself and everyone else. It was Catherine who finally broke through to him, showing up at his apartment unannounced one Saturday afternoon about 14 months after the gala. She had to bang on the door for 5 minutes before he answered, and when he finally did, she was shocked by his appearance. Her father, who had always been impeccably groomed and dressed, looked like a stranger. Unshaven, unwashed, wearing stained sweatpants and a t-shirt that looked like it hadn't been changed in days. The apartment behind him was a mess, empty bottles and takeout containers everywhere, curtains drawn, the air stale and thick. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "What are you doing to yourself?" He tried to shut the door, but she pushed past him into the apartment. She opened curtains, letting in light that made Edward wince. She started gathering trash, moving around the space with purpose. "You need help," she said. "Professional help. This isn't healthy. This isn't living." Edward laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "What's the point? Everything's gone. Everything I built, everything I thought I was, it's all gone. I'm nothing now. Catherine stopped cleaning and looked at her father, really looked at him, and felt a complicated mix of pity and anger and love. "You're not nothing," she said. "You're a man who made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. Who lived his whole life based on lies without even knowing they were lies. But you're still my father. And I still, God help me, I still care about you. But Dad, you have to actually deal with what happened. You have to face it, process it, accept it. Hiding in this apartment drinking yourself to death isn't dealing with it. It's just another form of denial.